Hello, this is Cheryl. Welcome back. I'm so glad that you're here today. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do a faux watercolor technique for card making. I'm going to do it two different ways. One way with Tombow markers, which is a dye-based marker, and another way with Copic markers, which is an alcohol-based marker. So these are the finished cards. I'm using a penny black stamp. Any solid silhouette stamp would work. I really like the penny black ones just because they tend to have a little bit more watercolor-ish detail to them. So the first thing I'm doing, the first cards I'm going to make are the ones with the Tombow markers, and I'm using the brush part of the marker to color in my stamp. So I start with the lighter shade. I typically have two shades of the same color. I start with the lighter one and fill in the whole area, and then I'll go in with the darker one and add the shadow to that area. Using two different shades of the same color just gives the stamp a little bit more dimension when you stamp it and a little bit more color variation. Now, as I said, I'm using the brush part of the marker, but I'm using it fairly lightly. If you use a heavy hand with it and really rub it on the stamp, you're going to ruin the end of your marker, especially with the dye-based marker, because the tips are a little bit more delicate than the Copic markers that I'm going to be using for the second part of the video. For coloring in the flowers, I'm doing the same process as the green. I'm using the lighter shade to completely fill in the whole flower, and then I'm going to use the darker shade to put in some shadows. I'm eliminating or I'm avoiding the center of the flower, and I'll go back in there with a yellow color. One of my favorite parts of this technique is you color the stamp once, and you can usually get at least two, if not three or more stampings out of it. Now, every time you go to stamp it, it is going to be a lighter shade than the previous one because there's less dye, less ink on the stamp, and we're adding just a little bit more water, so it's watering down the color a little bit, but that adds some interest and variety to your cards as well. Now, while you're watching me color, if you have a moment and are so inclined, please hit a like and subscribe to be notified of more videos. Now, as I said earlier, I'm using Tombow markers. They are a dye-based marker. Any dye-based marker should work for this technique. It doesn't necessarily have to be Tombows, and I know there are other dye markers on the market. This is just the only version that I have. Now, once you're done coloring in your flower, you're going to use a misting bottle to mist the ink. While we've been coloring, the ink has been drying on your stamp, so you can't just go and stamp it right from here. So I usually use 3 or 4 mists and hydrate that ink that's on the stamp. I hold my stamp in the center and then I press around it just to make sure it has good contact with the paper. And that is my first stamping. Now, before I do a second stamping, I'm going to use that same spray bottle and I'm going to spray the stamp again to rehydrate that ink and stamp it again. Now, for this particular one, I chose to only do it 2 times, but I probably could have gotten a third stamping out of it. It just would have been significantly lighter than those 2, but you can see how the second one is lighter than the first. So for my second card, I'm going to use Copic markers. This is an alcohol-based marker. And again, this technique is likely going to work for any alcohol-based marker. I just happen to only have Copics, so that is what I'm using. The process of coloring the stamp is exactly the same. I have 2 shades of every color. I'm doing the lightest shade first, and then I'm adding the shadows with the darkest shade. And it really doesn't matter the color order that you go in. For the first one, I did the green and then the red and then the yellow. This one, I'm doing the yellow, the red, and the green. You just want to make sure that you're not coloring over top of some of the other markers, other marker colors that are on your stamp, and changing your image. So I do avoid going over places that have been colored with a different color. So once again, I'm doing the lightest color first, and then I'm going in with the darker shade and adding the shadow. One thing I forgot to mention with the first one with the dye-based markers, all you really need to do is rinse your stamp under a running tap to clean off the ink. For the alcohol-based markers, you're going to need a permanent stamp cleaner in order to clean that ink off of your stamp. So you do want to use a permanent cleaner, just water is not going to work. And for the first one, we used water to hydrate the ink. That is not going to work for alcohol-based inks. What we're going to use to hydrate the ink again is some isopropyl alcohol. So I have some in a spray bottle. You'll see it in just a moment. And I do spray between each and every stamping, just like the first one. Now, while I'm coloring with my markers, I tend to use the side of my marker just because it covers more surface in a quicker amount of time. You could use the tips, but you're just going to be coloring a little bit longer than if you use the side of your marker. For the Copic markers, the tips are higher quality than the Tombow markers, so you can be a little bit rougher with them. And if by chance you ever have a Copic marker that the tip goes funny or starts to disintegrate, you can actually replace the tips on the markers, which is very handy, and you can't do that with the dye-based markers. The other great thing about the alcohol-based markers, the Copic markers, is you can also get refills for them. So you can refill the markers when the ink starts to run out, making them a little bit more eco-friendly. You don't have to throw the marker away. You can get replacement parts for the tips, for the ink, that sort of thing, which is great. They're definitely more of an investment to begin with, but they do end up lasting a lot longer because you can replace different things. So there's my misting bottle with my isopropyl alcohol on it. I'm going to mist it the same way as I misted my first one. I usually use 3 or 4 spritzes, just a light coat over the whole thing, and then stamp it. And when you're stamping it, hold it in the center to make sure the stamp doesn't slip or move, and then press around it to make sure it has good contact with the paper. So for the alcohol-based ones, I'm actually stamping it on a glossy cardstock. Alcohol ink and alcohol markers just are a little bit more vibrant. They just look a lot nicer on glossy cardstock. So that's what I'm using for this one. For the dye-based ones, I just use regular cardstock. It's not going to matter, and it's actually not going to dry on a glossy cardstock. So you can just use regular cardstock for that. So I was originally going to just stamp it twice, and then I thought, you know what, let's do it a third time just to see what we can get out of that third stamping. And it is significantly lighter, but I do quite like it. And once again, I did mist between the second and the third stamping to make sure to rehydrate the ink that was left on there. And I left it at stamping at 3. I didn't think there was going to be much color left on the stamp after the third one, but you can see how the color variation goes significantly lighter with each stamping. So after this, I went and cut them down to 3 3/4 by 5-inch size. And I'm going to stamp the sentiment. The sentiment comes with the poinsettia stamp. I'm going to stamp it with a Versamark ink, which is a sticky embossing ink. And I'm going to heat emboss Season's Greetings on it with gold embossing powder. So I'm showing you me doing the first one, and then I'll do the other 4 off camera. You do need to use a specific heat gun for embossing with embossing powder. A hairdryer will not work. You need something that emits heat that will melt the powder and not blow it off. If you happen to have powder anywhere on your card that you don't want it to be there permanently, you need to use a soft brush to brush it off so that it doesn't melt right onto the card. So you can see the embossing powder change as the heat melts that powder. It goes from being dark and granular to lighter and shiny and glossy, and perfect for a festive holiday card. After I embossed all of them, I chose a mat that kind of matched each of the inks for those poinsettias. So each of the mats are a different color, and they were cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and I'm putting them on a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch card base. I'm using some distressed Collage medium glue to glue them on. I like this glue because if any happens to seep out, it dries completely matte and completely clear, so you can't see that there was any glue there. Once I have all of my cards glued together, and I'll do the other 4 off screen, I'm just going to add some Glisten Stickles to the centers of the poinsettias and a little bit to the greenery, just to add a little bit of sparkle to the card. I like Glisten because it's fairly transparent, but it's just got a bit of a gold touch. I'm not really a gold person, so I don't do a whole lot with gold, but you could use just a metallic gold stickles as well if you like. I like the stickles because they have a really fine tip, and you can get the glitter exactly where you want it, and it's just a lot less hassle than using loose glitter. So I'm going to put the stickles on the same spots on each of the cards, and then I'm going to let them dry for probably about an hour. Drying time really depends on how much you add. This isn't a lot, but it does take a little bit for it to dry completely, but an hour is usually a pretty good amount of time. Typically, if I have stickles, wet stickles on something, I'll set it aside where I can't reach it, or I will leave the room for a while because otherwise I'll tend to touch it. So this whole video is done in real time, and aside from the stamping and embossing of the other 4 cards and the cutting and gluing the card bases together, you can really get several cards in a significantly short amount of time, which is great. If you have a lot of holiday cards to do, this is a perfect technique for it. It's great to be able to do a bunch of them all at once. Once again, if this is the type of videos that you're interested in, please hit a like and subscribe and the notifications button to be notified of more videos. I will show you the completed and dried cards in a moment. So this is them all dry. Now I've got 5 holiday cards all ready to send out when the time is right. Have a great day. Thank you so much for watching.